Life according to reason is best and pleasantest, since reason, more than anything else, is man. This life, therefore, is also the happiest. Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10. Hey, welcome to ParkNotes. I'm Parker Sedecase. I'm a graduate student in philosophy, and this is a channel where I help you study and think more deeply. In this video, I'm going to help you think more logically. I'll give you two very practical steps early on, so you can just grab onto those. I'm going to dive just a little bit deep into the nature of logic, the metaphysics of logic, meta-logic, the philosophy of logic, philosophical logic, just a little bit. It's not going to be that bad. I'll touch on an argument for God's existence from the metaphysics of logic, but then I'm going to get back into an intro and overview to logical thinking. And I'll leave you with a lot of book recommendations for you to get started with logic today. I'll recommend two types of notebooks that you should start keeping as you study logic, and maybe a third notebook to help you collect your thoughts. This video is sponsored by Brilliant, but more on that later. We've got a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. So when it comes to thinking more logically, I got two practical steps for you. They're really simple, they're really easy, they may be super obvious, but sometimes we miss the obvious stuff. So step one, write down your thoughts. It's that simple. Writing down your thoughts forces you to clearly express what you're thinking. Writing down your thoughts makes you analyze what you're thinking while you're thinking it. It makes you face your thoughts head on. This is what I actually believe and think, and it actually helps you formulate your thoughts. Maybe your thoughts aren't as clear as you thought. Maybe they're vague or ambiguous. The act of writing them down can help your thoughts take form. So I recommend you dedicate an entire notebook just to your own thoughts. This is my deep thinking philosophy journal. I bring this notebook, this journal with me to the coffee shop, and I try to formulate my thoughts to see how far I can go on my own steam. This process has helped me clarify my thoughts, helped me get clear on what I mean, what do I intend to say, what am I actually saying, am I really saying what I think I'm saying? And on top of that, it helps me remember my thoughts so I can come back to them and pick up where I left off. So the first step to thinking more logically is to write down your thoughts. The second practical step is super easy. It's start studying logic. Once you have your thoughts down on paper, you can begin evaluating them. And that's precisely what the discipline of logic teaches us to do. To evaluate our thoughts, our ideas, our arguments according to the right rules of reason, of logic. Now, logic, according to one of my favorite logicians, Harry Gensler, is the analysis and appraisal of arguments. Now, an argument is a manifestation of the reasoning process. That's a quote by another favorite logician of mine, D.Q. McInerney. But that's just one definition. I have a commonplace book for logic where I collect a lot of different definitions. So let's try a few on. Logic studies forms of reasoning. When you do logic, you try to clarify reasoning and separate good from bad reasoning. Logic is about clear and effective thinking. It is a science and an art. Logic is to philosophy what telescopes are to astronomy, or microscopes to biology, or math to physics. Logic helps us find truth, though it is not sufficient of itself to find truth. It helps us, especially 1, by demanding that we define our terms so that we understand what we mean, and 2, by demanding that we give good reasons, arguments, proofs. Logic is the science of necessary inference. Logic is the art of using reason well in our inquiries after truth, and the communication of it to others. Now, the design of logic is to teach us the right use of our reason or intellectual powers and the improvement of them in ourselves and others. The whole purpose of reasoning, of logic, is to arrive at the truth of things. So those are just a few extra ones for you. I think we're getting a sense that logic is a skill, a science, and an art. It's the skill of right reasoning that you can get better at as you work to become more logical, to memorize more arguments, to evaluate your own arguments. It's a skill you can grow in. It's a science. You can discover the laws of logic out there in the world. You can discover the form of right reasoning and utilize well-worn arguments in the history of philosophy. You can evaluate the very process itself. And it's an art because the reasoner can be creative in developing, evaluating, and giving their own arguments. So logic is the analysis and appraisal of arguments. An argument is a manifestation of the reasoning process, and it's a skill, a science, and an art. So if you want to think more logically, 1, write down your thoughts. 2, start studying logic and start evaluating the thoughts that you've written down. It's pretty much that simple. But on this channel, I help you study and think more deeply. So I have to say a little bit about the foundation of logic, meta-logic, philosophical logic, the philosophy of logic. What is this thing we call logic? Well, according to Harry Gensler, logic began in the year 1 million BC with Fred Flintstone. He says, Fred Flintstone is the first to put a valid argument into words. If I hide, then the saber-toothed tigers will not eat me. I will hide. so they will not eat me. Boom, logical reasoning is born. But more seriously, Gensler traces it back to 600 to 400 BC with ancient Greek philosophers like Pythagoras and others, who prove geometric theorems, Heraclitus and Parmenides, who dispute the law of non-contradiction, Zeno and others who reason about philosophical paradoxes, and the sophists who debate about politics. He traces it through Plato and Socrates down to Aristotle, who many consider to be the father of logic in that he's the first to formalize it and give an accounting of the laws of logic. This book, by the way, is the A to Z of logic. I highly recommend it. It's by Harry Gensler. Fantastic book. But what are the laws of logic? The three laws of classical logic are the law of non-contradiction, which was formerly the law of contradiction, but now we call it the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and the law of excluded middle. There are some who claim that the classical laws of logic are not really that classical, but only really trace back to the late 1800s, early 1900s with Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and Alfred North Whitehead. But I don't know, I think we can find the law of non-contradiction, at least, in Aristotle's Metaphysics, especially book Gamma, I believe? Yeah, book Gamma. But that's okay, let's ignore the debates right now and just assume these are the classical laws of logic, that they really do go back in time, and let me just lay them out for you. The law of non-contradiction says not both A and not A. That's a symbol for and that squiggle is the symbol for negation. So not both A and not A at the same time in the same way. That is, nothing is both true and false at the same time in the same way. The law of non-contradiction. The law of identity says A equals A. A is A. A thing is a thing. It's such a simple law that it's almost hard to explain. Just a thing is a thing. A is A. And then the law of excluded middle, A or not A. Think of that V as like a versus. So either A is true or not A is true. And it's not possible to be between these two. A proposition isn't like half true in between, floating in and out of truth or existence. So those are the classical laws of logic, and they're a pretty big deal. The prominent panpsychist philosopher Philip Goff thinks the laws of logic are so important that he gives a logic constraint on metaphysical theorizing. That is to say, every good metaphysical theory must account for the laws of logic. And he says that the logic constraint has two aspects, the metaphysical aspect and the epistemological aspect. According to Goff, the metaphysical aspect says, the metaphysician is obliged to postulate entities sufficient to ground the truth of the laws of logic. So in your metaphysical theorizing, you have to make room, you have to account, you have to be able to ground the laws of logic, say what they are. They're that important. And two, the epistemological aspect of the logic constraint says the metaphysician is obliged to account for our knowledge of the laws of logic. So it's not enough just to make room for them, to account for them, to ground them in your metaphysics. You must also give an accounting of how we know about the laws of logic. Epistemology just comes from the two Greek words episteme and logos, a word about knowledge, the study of knowledge. I know we're getting a little heady here, I'm almost done. Philosophers James Anderson and Greg Welty, in an attempt to make sense of the laws of logic, to ground them in their metaphysical theory, give an argument called the Lord of Non-Contradiction, where they try to ground the logical laws in the mind of God. Their argument runs like this. The laws of logic are truths. The laws of logic are truths about truths. I don't know why it's so hard to say truths. The laws of logic are necessary truths. That is, they're true in every possible world. There's no way that A and not A could both exist in the same way in the same time. The laws of logic really exist. The laws of logic necessarily exist. The laws of logic are non-physical. The laws of logic are thoughts. And therefore, there must be a non-physical, spiritual mind to ground the laws of logic, because no physical entity exists necessarily. Philosopher Alex Malpass summarizes their argument as follows. 1. If a thought exists necessarily, then it belongs to a necessarily existing mind. 2. The laws of logic are necessarily existing thoughts. 3. Therefore, there is a necessarily existent mind, aka God. Now, Malpass is an atheist philosopher himself. Welty and Anderson are Christian theist philosophers, and I actually had James Anderson and Alex Malpass on my podcast, Parker's Pensies, to debate this argument, the Lord of Non-Contradiction. So you can find that link somewhere up here if you guys are interested in seeing how the laws of logic are supposed to be grounded in God's mind, and to hear Alex Malpass argue against that argument. But enough metaphysics, let's get back to logic. Alright, so let's get back to some tips for studying logic. I'm going to give you guys some book recommendations and some other tips. But before I do that, I want to tell you about a free and easy way to start learning logic today. That is my sponsor for this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science all interactively. And that also includes logic. Brilliant is fun and interactive with thousands of lessons from basics to advanced topics, and new lessons are added every month. Whatever your skill level, Brilliant customizes content to fit your needs and let you solve at your own pace. Now, I've been taking a course on large language models as well as computer science, but I recently found this other course on logic. It's composed of 18 lessons with 10 practices, which will help you get your feet wet learning logic and practicing what you've learned immediately. I really love Brilliant, and I think you're going to love it too. And right now, my ParkNotes audience gets a 30-day free trial, and the first 200 subscribers get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription by using my link, brilliant.org/ParkNotes. That's brilliant.org/ParkNotes. You can find the link in the description or in the pinned comment. So I recommend taking advantage of that Brilliant deal, but let me give you some more book recommendations to help you on your logic journey. First up is Being Logical by D.Q. McInerney. I love this book. It's really helpful. It's really short. It's a great overview and introduction to the first order discipline of logic. Next up, and even more concise, is a rule book for arguments, the 4th edition by Anthony Weston. This is like a short little compendium on logic and argumentation. I also commend the Little Logic book, another really helpful intro, just going to be a little bit thicker. And this one's not strictly logic, but The Philosopher's Toolkit is a compendium of philosophical concepts and methods by Julian Baggini and Peter Fossel. This book is fantastic for getting your grip on the discipline of philosophy more generally, and it has very good information on logic specifically. If you were going to grab one book, I'd probably grab this one. So those are all going to be introduction books. Now, if you want to go just a little bit deeper, I recommend these Intro to Logic books. The first one by Harry Gensler. I have the 2nd edition, and I'm not sure how many there are, but if you grab this book, you're going to learn logic. Harry Gensler's the man. I really appreciate his work. Another really good one, especially for my Christian friends, is Vern Poitras's book, Logic, A God-Centered Approach to the Foundations of Western Thought. Dr. Poitras got his PhD in mathematics from Harvard, I believe, so many people will know him as a theologian, but he's got his logic chops as well. Now, I really appreciate that he goes in depth on the names of the arguments, like Celerant and all these medieval names for different arguments. Probably my favorite intro to logic textbook is The Art of Reasoning by David Kelly. This one's very clear, very concise, but very, very thorough. I wouldn't be showing you any of these books if I didn't recommend them. If you were going to buy one of the textbooks, I think I'd buy this one. And then lastly, Introduction to Logic by Irving Copey and Carl Cohen. This one's just a classic introduction to logic. It's a very good book. I have all these because I like to reference them. The authors give different definitions. They think differently about logic, so it's nice to have multiple resources to pull from. Now for the more advanced students, I would recommend David Papineau's Philosophical Devices, Proofs, Probabilities, Possibilities, and Sets. Another really, really good book, especially if you're trying to become a philosopher. You're going to have to learn sets and all these other mathematical terms which analytic philosophers use today. This is a great book. Another one I'm working through right now is More Precisely, The Math You Need to Do Philosophy. Now, is this strictly speaking logic? Well, not really, it's math, but it's math that philosophers use in their philosophy papers. So if you want to understand modern analytic philosophy papers, you're going to need to learn the concepts in this book. Now, if you want to go super duper deep into the philosophy of logic, like we talked about, there's this classical understanding of the laws of logic. There are others who deny one or more of these classic laws of logic. If you want to learn about those debates, you're going to be stepping into philosophical logic, the philosophy of logic. Meta-logic. This contemporary introduction by John McFarlane is very good. In fact, every book in the Routledge Contemporary Introduction to Philosophy is a very good book. So I highly recommend those if you want to dive deeper into philosophy. Another classic in the philosophy of logic is Susan Hack's Philosophy of Logics. This is kind of a big deal that she put an S there. There's this whole debate whether we should be monists or pluralists about logic. Is there just one logic or are there many logics? She talks about that in this book, which is a classic and super fantastic. And then lastly, a book I've picked up many times and have never finished, Logic for Philosophy by Theodore Ted Sider. This book is super duper hard. I don't recommend it for anyone except analytic philosophers. I've had a very hard time actually getting through it, but I'm hoping this spring to just sit down and read it cover to cover and download this stuff into my psyche. So good luck if you end up reading this book. So those are some book recommendations. But we're not done yet. I got 3 more tips for you. Next up, get a scratchbook and practice, practice, practice. Logic is like language. You need repetition in order to understand the symbols, get clear on the arguments, and recognize the different forms of argumentation. I think it's wise for you to have a book dedicated just to working through your logic problems. Plus, if you keep them all in one place, you can go back and revisit them. You can mark the ones that gave you more trouble than others, and you can go back and revisit them, work through them, and become an expert. So get yourself a scratchbook. Tip number 3, make your own logic commonplace book. So I just restarted my logic commonplace book. I did have it over here in this one, but this turned into my lifting log. So now I'm moving all the definitions, terms, concepts, difficult puzzles, fallacies, formal, informal, all back into my logic commonplace book. So I have a one-stop shop when I want to bone up on my logical terms and notations. So the kinds of things you should put in your own logic commonplace book are key terms, definitions from various authors so you can compare and contrast them, the puzzles that were especially difficult for you so you can study them and become an expert on them, different forms of arguments and their names, different fallacies like formal fallacies and informal fallacies, but be careful because throwing out terms like circular argument, circular reasoning, poisoning the well don't always help you in the conversation, and it's not always clear the person using those terms understand what they mean by those terms. So studying informal fallacies can be really helpful for yourself, but tossing around the terms to your interlocutors, to those you're debating with, is not always that helpful. If you can recognize that they're poisoning the well, it'll be easier for you to explain to them why that's bad and what they're doing. But if they don't know those terms, then that's not going to be helpful. And then tip number 4, start making your own arguments. Write down your thoughts like we said earlier. Form them into arguments and then evaluate them. Do I have good reasons for believing what I believe? And you can put all those thoughts into one journal for you to reflect on later, for you to go back and analyze, for you to critique yourself, and for you to learn from. All right, so that's it. That's how you can think more logically. I hope that's been helpful. If you guys learned something, let me know in the comments. And if you made it this far, leave me a thinking emoji in the comments. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't so you don't miss out on any future tips and tricks on how to study and think more deeply. I'll catch you guys next time.